Hello again. I want to talk to you about British North America and what life was like for the colonists. First of all, let's figure out what your average colonist was like. Most of them were poor when they came over. Remember that some of them were convicts that were given the choice of being hanged or spending a lifetime in prison or debtor's prison or coming to the New World. Some of them were indentured servants. About half of all Europeans coming to the New World came as indentured servants. So they worked for 4 to 7 years as an indentured servant. A lot of Europeans came to look for a better life. Most of them were male. Only about a third of them brought their families with them. And so there was always more men in the colonies than there were women, which is going to explain a couple things. Okay, but there was never enough men to do the labor that was required in order to maintain the economy, which is partly, again, why they turned to slavery and indentured servitude in the first place. All right, so what's going on here is for your typical person in the British North America, colonial in New Hampshire or whatever, right? Some of the things is, number one is for them, because they were coming in from a poorer environment, many of them had that opportunity to reinvent themselves. And the truth is, most of them, life was better for them in British North America, the colonies, than it was back in England. This is a time period England is going through a movement called the enclosure movement. And your wealthy landowners are putting up hedges, okay, or enclosures as fences. They didn't put up barbed wire fence or chain link fence like we think of. They put up plants or they put up hedges, which is kind of like some rope and some bare, real thin fence, and then planted plants, ivies and what have you along it, and then that plant becomes essentially a wall. Okay, and they do this because they're getting rid of their large fields and kind of moving those over to Ireland because they want Ireland to become the source of their export wealth, their wheat. They want to convert Ireland into kind of the wheat capital of Europe. And then in England, they're replacing all those wheat fields with herds of sheep and raising them for the wool. The problem is, if you're a landowner, you do not need as much workers for sheep as you do for wheat. And so you lay off lots of people, which is how, there's no jobs in the country. So you move to the big city, you hear about this new world, you run into a person who's recruiting, hey, you know what, be an indentured servant for a certain number of years, and then you can start over in the new world and you'll be debt free. And for a great many people, this was very attractive, and so a lot of them came over. And what they found was, number one, is when they were working for wages, oftentimes their wages were better in the British colonies than they were back in England. This is because of labor shortages. There was never enough skilled labor. And so if you were a shipwright or a cooper or somebody that had some sort of skilled labor, for example, a hat maker or a barrel maker, a cooper, right, then those people were paid a little bit more in the New World than they were in the Old World. Another thing that really kind of helped with financial situation is that your taxes were lower in the colonies than they were in the back in England. And this kind of flies in the face of maybe what we've heard about that, the no taxation without representation. The reason that's going to be angry, we're going to find out why they were so mad about these new taxes, is basically they had no taxes before. And so when you introduce those brand new taxes, people get pretty angry. And so, but for the most part, during this time period, we're still in the early 1700s, or so. Wow, things are going pretty well. If you can make it over here, if you've got the money, things are going pretty well if you're a European. Of course, as is probably doesn't have to be said too much, if you're an African, things are very different. If you are being brought over oftentimes, I've already mentioned how the slavery would work. with enslaving other villages, and so then you would come over and you would be worked very hard. You were probably worked in if you brought from Africa, you probably went to Brazil or to the Caribbean to work in the sugarcane fields, or if you were brought to the United States, you worked in the tobacco fields, and that was extremely backbreaking and hard labor. And you lost your culture. I think that's probably one of the things is that, like, I am Scottish, I am Irish, I am English, I am German, I am Dutch. I have ties to my ancestry and my culture, and for many of the slaves, one of the things that they lose is their touch with their ancestry. A lot of African Americans who are the descendants of slaves, actually, it's very difficult. They may or may not know where in Africa their ancestors lived, because their ancestors were enslaved, thrown into ships, and they were just all sold as Africans, not as Ashanti, not as people from Ghana or from Mali. They weren't Malis, they weren't Tutus or Hutus or um, you know. Anything like this, they were just Africans, and so they lost their language, they lost their culture, they lost their names, um, and that sense of loss is going to be one of the things that is going to really weigh heavily on the slaves. Another one is that they weren't their owners were frequently they at least made an effort to Christianize these Africans, although many of them were Christians when they came. They made an effort to Christianize them for the benefit of their soul. We work their body, but their soul belongs to God. And so there was a sense of, in fact, church services, which were, of course, were segregated. But for many slaves, I can see my cat go by here. For many slaves, religious services were the only time, one among the few times they could get together and they could socialize and have some downtime. And so religion became extremely important to their Christian. But because they didn't have steady, organized services, many times their services are going to be blended with their native beliefs, such as the kind of think voodoo kind of situations, and that's going to give a very unique feel to African American Christianity as they bring in some of the spiritualism that was prevalent in Africa and in the Caribbean, especially the Caribbean. And so they brought in, and this also gives rise to code words, which is kind of a strange thing. Sorry, my cat distracted me. I have ADD. So one of the things that happens is that they don't want to be slaves, but they can't openly talk about not being slaves. And so the African churches, African American churches, slave churches, they talk a lot about what's called liberation theology. And that liberation theology, in one sense, it sounds like they're talking about liberation after death, where they get to go to heaven and get a reward. But if you listen to it more closely, you hear they're actually talking about other things in addition to that. For example, there's an old American folk song called "I Am a Poor Wayfaring Stranger," and it goes, "I am a poor wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world of woe. But there's no sickness, toil, nor danger into this land to where I go. I'm going there to see my father. I'm going there no more to roam. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home." Well, the Jordan River oftentimes was a metaphor for the Ohio River, because if you could get over the Ohio River, you could potentially have won your freedom, because you'd be beyond the reach of your slave owner. And so that liberation theology takes on a double meaning, and so that is also happening. One thing I did not mention when I was talking about Spanish America, and I want to mention it now, is that Spanish America and British America have two very different law codes. And so I actually think, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about that here in a different slide. So until then, I'll talk to you later.